In 1973, the President of the United States did the unthinkable. He attacked the most sacred of American icons, the automobile. On live national television, at the height of the post-war suburban boom, Nixon urged his fellow freedom-loving, gas-guzzling Americans to carpool, or even, if you can believe it, consider taking public transit.
I want to talk to you tonight about a serious national problem. How many times have you gone along the highway or the freeway, wherever the case may be, and see hundreds and hundreds of cars with only one individual in that car?
And he imposed what no politician would dare suggest today: a national speed limit of just 55 miles an hour. This was no sudden appreciation for the environment, nor concern for our collective health or safety. No, this was an emergency, an energy emergency. An oil embargo led by Saudi Arabia had left gas stations from Seattle to Savannah with little or nothing to sell. And without abundant oil, the entire American lifestyle of abundance, long taken for granted, screeched to an abrupt and shocking halt. A superpower was confronted with its vulnerability, and it vowed never to let this happen again. Nixon boldly announced Project Independence. By 1980, he said the US would not depend on any other country for its energy. Well, that's not what happened. Far from it. Rather than the energy renaissance Nixon promised, the oil crisis marked the beginning of the end. This is peak oil. An alarming 1956 prediction that US crude production would hit a record high sometime around 1970, followed by a steep decline. At that point, the race would be on to extract what little was left. Now, peak oil is remembered as little more than an amusing throwback, along with flying cars and fear of overpopulation. If the oil apocalypse arrived, Americans haven't noticed. Today, we drive more giant SUVs and trucks than ever. But compare that 1956 prediction here with actual US oil production, excluding Alaska, here. Peak oil was real. Drilling fell precipitously after a 1970 high, almost exactly as predicted, down from 11 to just 7 million barrels a day by 2008. And Project Independence was a total failure. Imports doubled in 6 years, and we bought even more oil from Saudi Arabia in 2006 than we did in 1976. Then, something changed. Starting around 2008, the US oil industry experienced an unprecedented comeback that no one expected, transforming the country from an energy backwater to an energy superpower virtually overnight. 4 decades of production decline were reversed in just 5 years, reaching a record high of 12 million barrels a day in 2013. And the explosion didn't stop there. Year after year, production just kept growing and growing and growing. By 2018, the United States had become the #1 oil producer in the world, passing Canada, Russia, and even its oil nemesis, Saudi Arabia, which now supplies less than 3% of our needs. 2 years after that, we produced more than we consumed, a high bar, given that we use more than all of India and China put together. A single oil field in Texas now drills more oil than all but 2 other countries. What happened? Brought to you by Nebula, home to original series like Real Life Lore's Modern Conflicts, and the travel game show The Getaway. In the early 2000s, everyone assumed America's best oil days were over. Recall that output had peaked 30 years earlier, and had been on a rapid, predictable decline ever since. It's not that there wasn't plenty of oil left. There's plenty of oil buried deep underneath the Arctic, but that doesn't make it commercially viable to extract. The problem, very simply, is cost. When it comes time to sell it, oil is a fungible commodity. With a few exceptions, more on that another time, a barrel of crude is a barrel of crude. International markets, again to oversimplify, determine a single global price. But when it comes to drilling it, oil is very much not created equal. Some oil is stuck some 10,000 feet deep underwater. Expensive. Some oil just bubbles to the surface, waiting to be collected. Practically free. And some oil is literally stuck underneath the Oklahoma State Capitol building. Awkward. Naturally, the lowest hanging fruit is picked first. Whatever's cheapest to extract. And the cheapest of the cheap is known as conventional oil. This kind collects in vast underground pools. So you drill a hole in the ground and pump it up. Quick and easy. Well, we hit peak conventional way back in 1970, thus the subsequent decline. Then we moved on to more costly offshore drilling. Finally, we mined freezing cold Alaska for all it's worth in the 80s. And with all that thoroughly exhausted, only the very long tail of supply was left. In other words, the scraps. Much of what remained, for example, was trapped in a dense sedimentary rock called shale, meaning you'd have to first smash it open and then somehow recover the oil from inside. It's not as though we didn't know how. Hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, has been around in some form since the 1940s. The basic idea is that, like conventional, you first drill down, but then you inject high-pressure water, breaking up the rock along with sand, keeping the tiny holes in the shale open. And finally, you pump the now loose oil up to the surface. Now, this isn't rocket science, but it is just about as expensive. Not only did these extra steps make fracking more costly than conventional or offshore, they made it more expensive than oil was even worth, rendering the whole process more of an academic curiosity than a profitable technique. Meanwhile, big oil was bigger than ever. In 1998, for instance, Exxon and Mobil merged to become the ExxonMobil we know today. And these giant megacorporations were hungrier than ever for big new discoveries. For them, the juice simply wasn't worth the squeeze in America. What was left would only get harder and harder to drill for less and less profit. Why bother carefully cracking open rocks in North Dakota only to lose money when you could get rich just drilling and pumping in Brazil, Kazakhstan, or Ghana? So, with big oil deserting its own backyard for those giant untapped fields overseas, this left the US interior wide open and unprotected. And out of this competitive vacuum sprung wildcatters, individuals drilling largely on their own in hopes of striking gold. They were small, nimble, and hungry. At the same time, for unrelated reasons, increasing oil demand in places like China led to rapidly rising prices. That gap between what shale cost and what it was worth had never been smaller. So they started experimenting, trying to find any way they could to lower the cost. The first major breakthrough was horizontal drilling. One of the challenges of conventional vertical drilling is that you might just miss your target entirely, and then have to start all over again from the surface. But shale formations are arranged parallel to the ground, meaning you can drill horizontally and capture all that's available. Next, they started using longer and longer drills, 1, then 2, 3, and some even 4 miles across. They figured out how to locate highly productive sweet spots, and how far apart to space each drill to minimize interference between wells. And they perfected the sand, water, and chemical mixture to more effectively break open the rock and free the oil. With each innovation, the cost went down and the yield went up. It also didn't hurt that you essentially get 2 for the price of 1. Even if you're only drilling for crude, some free natural gas is exposed in the process. Although this is a double-edged sword. When properly captured, this natural gas byproduct can be a huge net positive for the environment because it often replaces coal, which is far dirtier. The problem, as critics rightly argue, is that when not properly captured, fracking leaks natural gas and thus methane into the atmosphere. And because methane traps 80 times more heat than carbon dioxide, if enough is leaked, it can offset the positive effect of replacing coal, making it a net negative. And that's not all. Fracking, whether for oil or gas, is also extremely water and sand intensive. A single well requires at least 1.5 million gallons of water, for instance, although some drillers reuse it. If spilled, this toxic, potentially radioactive frac fluid can contaminate drinking water, as it did in this small Pennsylvania town in 2009. For all these reasons and more, fracking continues to be controversial. But aside from the millions it spends on lobbying, the industry has another powerful weapon to use against its critics: a good story. At a time when the world's biggest corporations had written off America's future, individual men and women proved them wrong, made billions from nothing, and transformed the country into an energy superpower. Fracking, at least in its early days, was a story of scrappy, entrepreneurial underdogs. And it truly couldn't have happened anywhere else. The contiguous 48 states are enclosed by two sets of mountains, the Appalachian to the east and Rocky to the west. In the middle is a giant valley, the Great Plains. 70 million years ago, nearly this entire region was underwater. And as the fish, plants, and algae there died, their organic remains slowly turned into oil. This geological funnel produced layer after layer of highly concentrated shale, perfect for fracking. It's no coincidence that today, the largest shale fields are located right within this very same Great Plains corridor, from Montana and the Dakotas up north to West Texas down south. And notice something else about this region. It's pretty much empty. Drilling, recall, is a loud, dirty, and just generally ugly process. Transporting millions of gallons of water alone is liable to clog up your roads, to say nothing of the occasional explosion. Needless to say, neighbors tend not to like it. We'd have a problem if the Permian Basin, the crown jewel of American shale, were located in Anaheim. Fortunately, this is one of the country's least populated regions. It could hardly be further from our densely packed eastern and western seaboards. Aside from your rare Denver or Albuquerque, the big city out here looks like Fargo, North Dakota, or Billings, Montana. On the other hand, you also don't want your shale too remote. Fracking requires workers, workers require Walmarts, and Walmarts require highways. And while West Texas is certainly out of the way, it's definitely not devoid of Walmarts. The same cannot be said of many Russian oil fields way up in the Arctic Circle, accessible only by plane. In other words, here again, the United States won the geographic lottery, the perfect Goldilocks zone between proximity and remoteness. Plus, much of the infrastructure needed for fracking was already there, left over, remember, from the conventional boom that peaked in the 1970s. So, add all this up, America's perfect geography, shale's narrative appeal, the early 2000s unusually high oil prices, and simultaneous competitive vacuum, and you have all the ingredients for a boom of historical proportions with none of the political appetite to stop it. Since the turn of the century, the United States has had two types of presidents: those that have quietly supported the shale industry, and those that have loudly supported the shale industry. George Bush was an oil man himself. Barack Obama signed the most pro-fracking law in the nation's history. Donald Trump was practically an industry spokesman, and Joe Biden pleaded with oil companies to increase production. Another reason for shale's surprisingly bipartisan appeal is that it arrived at just the right time for the US economy and in just the right places. The shale revolution, recall, began its astonishing boom in 2008, conveniently in the depths of the Great Recession. Without it, those depths would have been far lower, and the subsequent recovery far slower. At a time when virtually every industry was struggling, during the era when companies were most aggressively outsourcing production to China, shale almost single-handedly propped up the American economy. According to one estimate, fracking alone, to say nothing of conventional oil and gas, was responsible for an incredible 40% of all GDP growth between 2008 and 13. About 2 million manufacturing jobs were lost during the recession. Yet, by 2015, shale had created about 1 million, both direct and indirect, helping to offset roughly half those losses. This was particularly acutely felt in places like West Texas, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Colorado, and New Mexico. Take tiny Williston, North Dakota, near the Canadian border, for example. Way back in 2012, this remote town of 15,000 people paid McDonald's workers $15 an hour, more than double the state's minimum wage today in 2024. But you didn't have to live in Williston or Midland, Texas to benefit from the shale boom. Fracking generated billions in tax revenue, gave Americans the cheapest energy of any OECD country, reduced our trade deficit, encouraged manufacturers to relocate back to the States, and directly saved taxpayers millions. The US military, after all, is the world's largest consumer of oil. Proudly or apologetically, knowingly or unknowingly, virtually every American has profited in one way or another. That is, except for one kind, the investor. The US shale industry has a secret. Between 2011 and 17, it lost about 33 cents for every dollar it spent. And needless to say, this, producing more oil than any other country in history, required spending a lot. By 2020, $300 billion had been set on fire. WeWork, by contrast, the gold standard of unprofitability, has lost a mere $15 billion since 2016. This, the shale revolution, and everything it enabled, in other words, was bought with debt. Lots and lots of debt. Whether we knew it or not, those $300 billion subsidized 15 years of American affluence. You and I paid less at the pump. Oil CEOs whose salaries were tied to production, not profit, raked in millions. And energy-intensive companies guzzled down dirt-cheap gas like it was no one's business. And the benefits went beyond our borders. Already a superpower, the United States also became an energy superpower, giving us yet another source of unrivaled geopolitical dominance. This abundance freed us from international blackmail, granted us leverage in the Middle East, and helped stabilize world oil prices, contributing to the post-Cold War era peace we, until recently, took for granted. Sure, we may still wish gas were cheaper, but there's been nothing like that 1973 crisis. In fact, in 2020, the price of oil briefly turned negative. But one need only look at this graph to see that something strange was going on. Something artificial, subsidized, and unsustainable. Truth be told, the shale boom has always been the product of a very particular and very temporary set of circumstances. And today, those circumstances are changing. The bill for all that debt is finally coming due. We're about to enter phase 2 of the shale revolution, the part where basic financial reality catches up to the industry, and investors start demanding positive returns. And just like the first, it too will transform America's place in the world, albeit in radically different ways. I've made a whole second video explaining what happens next, and you can watch it right now exclusively on Nebula. This video has been about how we got here, the sudden and dramatic rise of shale. But that's just half the story. Chapter 2 is about why shale has been so unprofitable, why US oil companies just keep drilling and drilling anyway, and most importantly, what lies ahead. What happens when that era of cheap oil abundance ends? Nebula, the only place you can watch it, is our ad-free premium streaming service. Along with this new exclusive, you can also watch my 6-part Nebula original series about China, in which I cover topics like how censorship actually works inside the country, how the one-child policy worked in practice, and much more. Just in the past few months alone, creators like Real Life Lore, TLDR News, Wendover Productions, Lindsay Ellis, Sean Nelson, Abigail Thorne, Neo, Jesse Gender, and others have released brand new originals. Personally, I've been watching the travel game show The Getaway. Without spoiling it, we put 6 of your favorite creators in a van, gave them all the same secret identity, and watched chaos unfold. I'm also looking forward to Tom Nicholas's upcoming documentary, Boomers, an in-depth documentary exploring how one generation, baby boomers, became so incredibly powerful. When we built Nebula, we did so with a basic premise, that you, not advertisers, are our customers. Unlike some other platforms, we make money when you, not PepsiCo, are happy. And that really makes a difference. Our iOS, Android, and smart TV apps are built from the ground up with careful attention to detail, not as mere afterthoughts to the website, for example. To get an annual subscription for 40% off, that's $36 a year or just $3 per month, use the link in the description or click the button on screen now. That's go.nebula.tv/polymatter. Alternatively, if you're not a fan of subscriptions, use the other link below to get lifetime access for a larger one-time payment.